The world of the Vikings is often imagined as loud and triumphant, filled with clashing steel, roaring longships, and endless feasts under torchlit halls. But before any of that glory could exist, there was survival. And survival, especially in the far north, was never guaranteed. To understand what Vikings truly ate when hunting failed and winter took over, we must first step quietly into their world at its most unforgiving moment, the slow arrival of winter, when the land hardened, the seas darkened, and hunger crept into every home. Picture the northern horizon in late autumn. The sun hangs lower each day, its warmth weakening, its presence shorter. Frost clings to the ground in the early mornings, sparkling briefly before fading into mud and ice. The forests grow silent as animals retreat or migrate, and the air carries a sharpness that bites the lungs. For the Viking family watching this change unfold, winter is not a season of beauty. It is a countdown. In this world, food is not a convenience. It is not chosen, purchased, or wasted. Food is life itself. Every meal represents hours of labor, risk, and uncertainty. When hunting is successful, there is relief, not celebration, but quiet gratitude. When it fails, there is fear, carefully hidden behind routine and tradition. The Viking homestead is modest, built low against the wind, its walls packed with earth, turf, and timber. Smoke drifts slowly from a hole in the roof, carrying the scent of firewood and whatever food remains cooking inside. Within these walls, families gather close as temperatures drop, sharing warmth, stories, and concern. The elders remember winters past. Some survived, some barely endured, some took lives. The children sense the tension even if they do not yet understand it. Hunting in the Viking world is never easy. It requires strength, skill, and luck. Men leave before dawn, moving quietly through forests and over frozen ground, tracking animals that grow more cautious with each passing week. A successful hunt can mean meat, fat, bones, and hides, resources that stretch far beyond a single meal. A failed hunt means returning home empty-handed, forced to meet waiting eyes without answers. As winter deepens, the odds turn against them. Snow covers tracks. Ice seals rivers. Storms lash the coast, making fishing dangerous or impossible. Even the most experienced hunter can fail when nature decides to withhold its gifts. And when this happens not once, but repeatedly, the reality becomes impossible to ignore. The stored food must now last longer than planned. This is where the true Viking story begins, not in conquest, but in endurance. Inside the longhouse, the fire burns constantly, though fuel is carefully rationed. Pots simmer slowly, often filled with more water than food. Meals become smaller, quieter. Each bite is chewed thoughtfully, not rushed. There is no excess. There is no certainty about tomorrow. Hunger becomes a presence, not sudden, but gradual, like a shadow growing longer across the floor. The Vikings understood something deeply that modern life often forgets. Nature does not negotiate. It does not care about bravery, reputation, or past victories. It offers abundance at times, and hardship at others, without explanation. To live in this world is to accept that reality and adapt to it as best one can. Winter transforms everything. Travel becomes dangerous. Communication between settlements slows or stops entirely. If one community struggles, there is no guarantee another can help. Each household becomes its own small universe, relying on what it has already gathered, preserved, or prepared. The success or failure of the previous seasons now determines who will endure until spring. Yet even in this harshness, there is rhythm. The Vikings do not panic. They follow patterns passed down through generations. Food is stretched. Recipes change. What was once nourishment becomes survival rations. Fat, once plentiful, is now precious. Broths are thinned. Bread is smaller. Nothing is thrown away. Bones are cracked, boiled, and boiled again, until even their last essence is drawn out. Children learn early that hunger is not weakness. It is part of life. Elders teach patience, restraint, and respect for food. Stories are told not just to entertain, but to remind of winters survived, of clever solutions, of hope that returns with the light. These stories are as important as food itself, feeding the mind when the body grows tired. Outside, the landscape sleeps under ice and snow. Trees stand bare and still. The world feels paused, suspended in cold silence. Inside, life continues slowly, deliberately. The Vikings endure not because they are fearless, but because they are prepared to endure discomfort, uncertainty, and restraint. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Before we speak of preserved foods, foraging, or last resort meals, we must understand this truth. Viking survival was not defined by abundance, but by adaptation. Their strength lay not in endless feasts, but in their ability to face scarcity without surrendering to despair. As winter tightens its grip and hunting grows unreliable, the Viking world narrows. Focus shifts inward, to the hearth, the storehouse, the shared pot. Every sound outside could be danger. Every quiet day without success weighs heavily. And yet, life goes on, measured not in victories, but in days endured. This is the reality behind the legend. A world where survival is earned slowly, patiently, and together. And it is within this reality that we begin to understand what Vikings truly ate when hunting failed, and how they faced the longest, coldest nights with resolve, ingenuity, and quiet strength. When we imagine the Vikings, it's often through the lens of battle-scarred warriors charging across the seas, their longships cutting through waves under a blood-red sky. Their swords gleam, their shields shine, and their axes are raised in triumph. But this image, while captivating, only tells part of the story. The Viking world was not defined solely by conquests or the thrill of battle. It was a world built on the gritty, mundane, and sometimes excruciating reality of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. To truly understand what the Vikings ate when winter set in, when their hunts failed, and when hunger began to gnaw at their resolve, we must step away from the glory of war and enter the quiet, unyielding world of daily life. It was here, far from the shining halls of Valhalla, that the true spirit of the Viking people was forged. This world was not filled with constant victories, but with the steady pulse of survival, the delicate balance between nature's gifts and its cruel demands. Viking life, especially in the northernmost reaches of Scandinavia, was not glamorous. It was hard, labor-intensive, and often marked by an underlying fear of what the seasons might bring. The Viking homestead was a simple, utilitarian structure built to withstand the biting cold and ferocious winds of the Nordic winters. The longhouse, a long, low building made of wood and thatched roof, served as the heart of every Viking settlement. Inside, families huddled close for warmth, sharing not only their meals but their lives, as the outside world turned inhospitable. The Vikings were not merely warriors, they were farmers, herders, hunters, fishermen, and artisans. Their lives were built around the cycles of nature. Farming, especially in the harsh northern climates, was a grueling task. Fields were small, and the growing season was short. The soil, while fertile in certain areas, could not support the crops needed to feed an entire population without careful planning. The Viking farmer was at the mercy of the land's whims. A good year could mean surplus grain, livestock, and a sense of security. A bad year could leave a family facing near starvation. But farming was not the only way to survive. The Vikings also relied heavily on their animals: cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, all of which played critical roles in providing milk, meat, wool, leather, and even manure for the soil. These animals were not merely pets or companions, they were lifelines. Vikings understood this relationship with their livestock deeply, and they treated them with great care. The animals were essential to their survival, and every part of them was utilized. The meat was eaten, the bones were crafted into tools or jewelry, the skins were turned into clothing or shelter, and even the entrails were not wasted but made into sausages, or used for bait in fishing traps. Yet, farming and animal husbandry alone could not sustain the Vikings through the long, dark winters. Hunting was another essential activity, though it was not always successful. The forests were filled with game, deer, elk, wild boar, and other animals, but hunting was far from a guaranteed source of food. It was an activity fraught with difficulty, requiring skill, patience, and an understanding of the land. Viking hunters would venture out into the snow-covered forests or across frozen rivers, tracking animals and laying traps. But even the most experienced hunter knew that success was not assured. If the hunt failed, there was little time to waste, for winter could turn deadly in a matter of weeks. Fishing, too, was an important part of Viking life, especially in coastal regions. The cold waters of the North Sea teemed with fish, and the Vikings were skilled at catching everything from cod to herring. Fishing was a reliable way to supplement their diet, but the risks were high. Storms could destroy boats, and the deep winter waters could be unforgiving. As with hunting, fishing was a gamble, one that could mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. As the days grew shorter and the cold set in, the Viking family would turn inward. The longhouse, with its central hearth, became a sanctuary from the relentless cold outside. Life within the longhouse was focused on preparing for the harsh months ahead. Preserving food was an essential task, one that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The Vikings used several methods to ensure they had enough food to last through the winter: drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting. Meat was often smoked to preserve it, fish dried on racks, and vegetables stored in cool, dry conditions to prevent spoilage. These preservation techniques were critical in a world where fresh food was not always available. But the struggle for survival did not end with the harvest or the hunt. The Vikings were always at the mercy of the elements, and winter could be an especially unforgiving time. Storms would block the roads, freeze the rivers, and isolate settlements. The Vikings lived in constant anticipation of the coming cold. They understood that when the snows came, the world would slow to a crawl. For the Vikings, the arrival of winter was not a beautiful spectacle but a looming, cold certainty. The snow would bury the fields, make hunting near impossible, and leave them to depend on the stores they had prepared earlier in the year. During these long months, life inside the longhouse became a mix of waiting, working, and enduring. The hearth at the center of the house was the only source of warmth, and it crackled steadily as the wind howled outside. The light from the fire flickered against the walls, creating a sense of security, even as the cold seemed to press in from all sides. The hearth was where the family gathered to eat, to share stories, and to keep hope alive. As food stocks dwindled and hunting grew more difficult, the Vikings would turn to whatever they had left. Every morsel was precious. The younger members of the family might forage for mushrooms, berries, and herbs that could be found in the snow-covered woods, though this was increasingly difficult as the season progressed. The older members would recall the lessons of survival: how to stretch a meal, how to make the most of every scrap. No food went to waste. Even the bones of animals, after the meat was stripped away, were boiled for hours to extract every ounce of nourishment. It was in this quiet struggle that the Vikings showed their true strength, not in battle, but in their ability to adapt, to persevere, and to make do with what they had. It is easy to romanticize the Viking warrior, charging across foreign lands, collecting treasure, and winning glory. But the true strength of the Viking people lay in their ability to survive, not through endless feasts and riches, but through hardship, resilience, and careful planning. Their world, though often unforgiving and bleak, was one in which every action, from hunting to foraging, from fishing to preserving, was an act of survival. And it was within this world of hard work, sacrifice, and quiet determination that the Vikings found their true calling, not as conquerors of lands, but as conquerors of the most difficult challenge of all, life itself. To understand what Vikings ate when hunting failed and winter took over, it's essential to grasp the broader picture of their diet, what they relied on when times were better, and how they made do when those resources ran dry. The Viking diet was not built around indulgence or luxury, but around survival. Every choice was rooted in the need to live through the brutal winters and to make the most of what the land and animals could provide. For the Viking, food was not just a source of sustenance but a cornerstone of existence itself. It was the fuel for their hard work, the reward for their labor, and the foundation for their strength in battle. At the heart of the Viking diet was the meat of domesticated animals, and they knew how to make the most of every part of these animals. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats were commonly raised on Viking farms. Each provided a specific set of resources, not only meat, but also milk, fat, wool, and hides, all of which were critical for survival in a land where every resource was precious. Meat from these animals was consumed regularly, but it was far from the only thing they ate. The Vikings' diet was surprisingly varied, and though it was based on what they could raise or catch, it was also supplemented by what they could grow, forage, or preserve. Cattle, especially, were important for more than just their meat. While they were occasionally slaughtered for a feast, the primary role of cattle was as a source of milk. Dairy products like butter and cheese were staples in the Viking diet, especially in the colder months when fresh meat became scarce. The Vikings were skilled at producing rich, flavorful butter, which they used not only for cooking but also as a valuable trade item. Cheese, made from cow, goat, and sheep milk, was essential for nutrition and could be preserved for long periods, an important trait when fresh food was in short supply. The fat from these animals was equally crucial. It could be rendered down and used in cooking or for preserving other foods. In an era before refrigeration, fat was one of the few methods for preserving meats and ensuring they would last through the winter. Pigs, though less frequently seen as a main source of food, were nonetheless a critical part of the Viking diet. When slaughtered, pigs provided not only meat but also valuable byproducts. Bacon, sausages, and cured hams were common fare. These meats were often smoked or salted to preserve them for later use. Pigs also produced lard, which was used for cooking or, in the case of the most desperate winters, as a form of emergency sustenance. Similarly, sheep and goats were raised primarily for their milk, meat, and wool, with their hides being highly prized for clothing and tents. Like the pigs, they were a multi-purpose animal, providing everything from food to tools to warmth. But not all Viking food came from domesticated animals. The Vikings were highly skilled hunters, and their diet was often supplemented with game that they captured during the long months before winter. These hunts brought a welcome change from the routine of farm life. Deer, elk, and wild boar were prized for their meat. These animals could provide large quantities of food, which was preserved through smoking, drying, or salting. The hunters would spend days in the forest, their lives dependent on their ability to track and capture game. Even in the most favorable seasons, hunting was no guarantee. The skills required to capture these animals were immense, and a failed hunt meant the difference between a hearty meal and meager rations. Fishing was another important source of food, particularly in the coastal regions of Scandinavia. The Vikings were expert fishermen, and fish formed an important part of their diet, especially when fresh meat was unavailable. Cod, herring, and salmon were commonly caught, and the methods for fishing were varied and effective. They used nets, lines, and even traps to catch fish, and their skills in the water were as important to their survival as their skills on land. Fish could be preserved by drying, salting, or fermenting, ensuring they would be available throughout the long winter. In fact, dried and salted fish were not only a staple for Viking families but also an important export that helped sustain their economy. While meat and fish formed the backbone of the Viking diet, the Vikings were also farmers and foragers, and their diet was supplemented by a variety of grains, vegetables, and fruits. The Vikings grew barley, oats, and rye, which were made into bread and porridge. Barley, in particular, was highly prized for its versatility and could be used in a range of dishes. The bread, often flat and simple, was a mainstay of their meals. Porridge, too, was a common dish, eaten both for breakfast and dinner, and it could be sweetened with honey or fruit when available. Root vegetables, such as turnips, carrots, and onions, were cultivated as well. These hardy vegetables could survive the cold and could be stored for long periods. In the depths of winter, they provided essential nutrients when fresh greens were hard to come by. Berries, especially lingonberries, grew in abundance in the summer months, and the Vikings would gather them to preserve for later use. They would also forage for wild mushrooms, herbs, and nuts when the opportunity arose. These items, though secondary to meat and dairy, played an important role in rounding out the diet and providing vitamins and nutrients that were vital for overall health. The preservation of food was a skill that the Vikings honed with great care. Fresh food could not be relied upon for long, especially in the harsh winters when hunting became difficult and crops were dormant beneath the snow. Preservation was, therefore, crucial for survival. The Vikings employed several methods for storing food, with salting, drying, and smoking being the most common. Meat, especially fish and game, was salted to preserve it. Drying, either by air or smoke, removed moisture from food, preventing it from spoiling. Smoking, in particular, was an effective method for preserving fish and meats, and it added a distinctive flavor that was integral to Viking cuisine. For vegetables and grains, the Vikings used cool, dry storage areas, such as cellars, to ensure they stayed fresh and edible through the cold months. When we consider the Viking diet, it's important to remember that it wasn't just about what they ate, it was also about how they ate. Meals were typically communal, shared with family and community members. The longhouse was the center of social life, and the hearth was where the food was cooked, where stories were told, and where the bonds of kinship were strengthened. Meals, though modest, were important moments of connection in an otherwise harsh existence. A meal of simple bread, cheese, and smoked meat could provide the nourishment necessary to endure the day's work, but it also served as a time to gather, to share, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. In the winter months, when food was scarce and the world outside was locked in ice and snow, the Viking diet shifted once more. The preserved foods, salted meats, dried fish, cured cheeses, and root vegetables became the lifeline for the family. The cold, dark days seemed to stretch on endlessly, but the longhouse offered a place of warmth and sustenance, where the fire burned bright and the food, though sparse, was enough to keep body and spirit alive. In these moments, the Vikings relied not just on the resources they had accumulated but on the ingenuity that had allowed them to thrive in one of the most difficult climates on Earth. Every meal, every morsel of food, was the product of hard work, patience, and careful planning. The Viking diet was a reflection of the larger Viking spirit, resilient, resourceful, and ever-adaptive. And it is through this lens that we begin to understand what they ate when their hunts failed and winter took over, not lavish feasts, but meals of simple sustenance, forged through effort, perseverance, and a deep understanding of how to live in harmony with nature. As the days shortened and the first frost began to settle on the ground, the Vikings braced themselves for the inevitable arrival of winter. To them, winter was more than just a season. It was a force of nature that defined their existence. The cold, the darkness, and the harsh winds of the Nordic winters were not mere inconveniences, they were constant companions, shaping the way Vikings lived, ate, and survived. Every aspect of Viking life revolved around the seasons, and the transition from the relatively mild autumn to the brutal winter was a time of reckoning, of preparation, and of quiet endurance. When we think of the Vikings, we often imagine a world full of battle, adventure, and daring exploration. Yet, these tales of glory and conquest were built on a foundation of survival, and survival in the north meant enduring winters that could stretch long and cruel. Winter in Scandinavia was not a simple season of cold. It was a time when the land itself seemed to close its doors, when hunting grew difficult, when the seas turned treacherous, and when food stores from the summer were all that stood between the Vikings and starvation. The approach of winter brought with it a sense of urgency. The Vikings knew that the days of abundance were numbered. The harvest, while a vital part of their diet, would not last long into the cold months. Crops could only be stored for so long before they spoiled, and hunting, which was already a gamble, became even more uncertain as animals retreated or grew harder to find. The rivers froze, making fishing nearly impossible, and the deep snows blanketed the forests, hiding animal tracks and making travel treacherous. As the temperature dropped, every resource was stretched thinner, and the Vikings turned inward, relying on what they had gathered during the more hospitable months. In these early days of winter, the Vikings knew that there was still time to prepare, but it was running out. They would gather what little remained from the fields, picking root vegetables, gathering herbs, and checking the storage bins for any last remnants of fresh food. The preservation of food had already begun long before the first frost had touched the earth. The Vikings were masters of preservation, using salt, smoke, and drying to ensure that the food they had worked so hard to gather would last through the long, dark months ahead. Meat, fish, and even dairy products were stored in ways that would prevent spoilage, but these stores were finite. No matter how much they had prepared, there would come a time when the shelves ran bare, and the longhouse would grow quieter as the last morsels were consumed. As winter took hold, the rhythm of life shifted dramatically. The harsh winds howled through the trees, stripping them bare. The sun, when it deigned to appear, hung low in the sky, offering little warmth and even less light. For the Vikings, this was not a time for celebration or feasting. It was a time for survival. The focus of every family and every community shifted from expansion and exploration to enduring the long stretch of winter ahead. The hunt, so crucial to the Viking diet, slowed or ceased entirely. The animals that roamed the forests were few and far between, and the once reliable rivers were now solid blocks of ice. The time for gathering was over, and now the Vikings would have to rely on what they had preserved and stored. The cold of winter could drive people to desperation. Food, once abundant in the summer, now felt scarce. There was a certain psychological weight to the winter months, a tension that grew with each passing week. The warmth of the hearth inside the longhouse became a lifeline, and the Vikings gathered around the fire, sharing stories, songs, and even their fears. The communal aspect of Viking life became even more pronounced during winter, as people huddled together for warmth, comfort, and a sense of solidarity. No one was immune to the effects of hunger, and the cold was a reminder that survival required not only physical strength but also mental resilience. As the weather grew more severe, the Vikings were forced to rely more heavily on their stored food. The preserved meats, fish, and dairy would be their primary sustenance, supplemented by whatever they could forage or hunt in the rare moments when the weather allowed. The root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and onions, became even more important as they provided some of the few fresh nutrients available. These foods were often boiled into stews or eaten as simple dishes, providing the necessary calories to keep the body functioning. But food scarcity wasn't the only challenge that winter presented. The cold could be punishing, seeping into every crack and crevice of the longhouse, making even the simplest of tasks more difficult. Water froze in the containers, and the firewood, once plentiful, began to run low. The Vikings were accustomed to living in close quarters, but the winter months intensified the sense of confinement. There was no easy escape from the cold, and each day seemed to stretch longer as the sun failed to rise high enough to bring warmth. The longhouse became not just a home, but a sanctuary, a place to gather warmth, food, and companionship in the face of a world that had turned against them. In these difficult months, the Vikings also turned to each other for support. The bond between family members was tested in ways that only the extremes of winter could provoke. The elders shared their wisdom, telling tales of winters long past, of survival strategies and stories of hope. The younger generations, learning from their elders, absorbed these lessons, not just about how to make it through the winter, but about how to endure. It wasn't just about surviving the season physically, it was about surviving it mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. The communal nature of Viking society was perhaps most evident during these long, dark months. The bonds between neighbors, friends, and extended family were strengthened by shared hardship. Together, they worked to ensure that no one would go hungry and that no one would face the winter alone. The spirit of cooperation and mutual aid was crucial, as every family's survival depended on the community as a whole. Whether it was sharing food, splitting firewood, or simply providing companionship during the long nights, the Vikings relied on each other to get through the bleakest of seasons. The cold grip of winter was not just an external force, it was a constant companion, shaping the Vikings' way of life in ways that could not be ignored. It demanded respect, preparation, and strength. Those who could not adapt to the brutal realities of winter were unlikely to survive. The cold was a reminder that in the Viking world, the struggle for survival was ongoing, and no amount of battle prowess could protect you from the unforgiving hand of nature. The Vikings may have conquered lands, but they were, at their core, survivors. And it was in the face of winter's cold grip that they proved their true strength. Winter, then, was not merely a season of hardship, it was a defining period that tested the resilience and resourcefulness of the Viking people. It was a time when survival was not just about physical strength or the might of a warrior's arm, but about the quiet, steady determination to endure, to adapt, and to keep moving forward, even when the world around you seemed to be closing in. Imagine the tense silence that falls over the Viking community when the hunter returns empty-handed, his footsteps heavy with the weight of failure. The Vikings, with their fierce reputation and their mastery over the land and seas, had long relied on hunting as one of their primary means of sustenance. But in the deep winter months, when the landscape is blanketed in snow and the days are short, a failed hunt is not just an inconvenience, it is a crisis. It represents the harsh reality of survival in a world where food could not be taken for granted. The Vikings knew, above all, that nature's bounty was as fickle as it was precious, and when hunting failed, the consequences were immediate and severe. For the Viking hunter, there was a routine to the hunt, a rhythm that had been honed over generations. Before dawn, the hunter would set out, armed with the weapons that had been passed down through his family, knowing full well that success was never guaranteed. The world around him was already changing. The forests, once teeming with life, were now silent and still. Game was harder to find, animals were more cautious, and the cold had made hunting even more difficult. The Vikings had long relied on their sharp instincts, their deep knowledge of the land, and the tools they had crafted with great care. Yet despite all this, nature could still deny them success. The deer might be gone, the boar too elusive, or the rabbit scarce. When a hunt failed, the return to the village was often quiet. The hunter would enter the longhouse with no story to tell, no prize to present. There would be no triumphant display of meat, no feast for the family. Instead, the sense of quiet dread would fill the air. The people inside the longhouse would watch, waiting for news, hoping for a sign that the hunt had been successful. The tension in the room would rise as the hunter's face, usually one of hardened resolve, now showed the signs of disappointment. His failure was not just his own, it was shared by the whole community. The shared sense of dread that came with a failed hunt was almost tangible as everyone knew the truth. Without fresh game, the rations would soon run out, and the long winter would stretch even longer. Hunting was not simply about filling the stomach, it was a matter of survival. The Vikings understood that without a successful hunt, their stores of food, dried fish, salted meats, preserved vegetables, would dwindle, leaving them with nothing but empty stomachs and the harsh northern cold. They knew that a failed hunt could lead to a long, hungry winter, where every meal would be a struggle. When the hunt failed, the question that loomed over them was not whether they would have enough to eat that day, but whether they would survive at all. The failure of a hunt was a blow not just to the body but to the spirit. The Vikings, for all their outward strength, were deeply connected to the land, to nature, and to the rhythms of the seasons. Hunting was an ancient tradition, one that carried with it the weight of their ancestors' successes and failures. When a hunt failed, it felt as though the very connection between the Viking and the land had been severed. They were no longer in control. Nature had proven its power, reminding them that survival was never a given, no matter how skilled they were, no matter how prepared. It was a humbling reminder of their vulnerability. But even in the face of such failure, the Vikings were not a people given to despair. They had learned long ago that survival meant more than just individual effort. It was a communal endeavor, and the failure of one hunter could be mitigated by the strength of the entire village. The community would come together in the wake of a failed hunt, pooling their resources, sharing what little food remained, and turning to other forms of sustenance. Foraging, fishing, and the slow, methodical process of drawing upon their preserved stores became even more crucial. But the strain was undeniable. The tension would mount as the days passed, the weather grew colder, and the stores began to dwindle. The Vikings knew they could not afford many failed hunts. Their survival depended on success, or at least the hope that the next hunt would be better. As the days wore on and the cold tightened its grip, the failure of the hunt would become even more significant. The Vikings knew they had to adapt, to find new ways of sustaining themselves. They would turn to what they had stored, dried fish, salted meats, grains, but these supplies would not last forever. There would come a point when they would be forced to rely on other methods, scavenging what they could from the land, foraging in the snow-covered forests for berries, mushrooms, or roots that might still be edible. But this too was a gamble. The longer the winter stretched on, the more desperate the search for food would become. The communal hearth, once a place of warmth and comfort, now became a symbol of survival. Families huddled around the fire, the smell of broth simmering over the flame mixing with the acrid scent of wood smoke. The heat from the fire was a small comfort in a world of bitter cold, but it could not replace the food that was missing. Each meal became more meager, more symbolic of the struggle they faced. The Vikings were no longer eating for sustenance alone, they were eating for endurance. Every bite was a reminder of how much longer they would have to survive. And yet, even in this desperate time, there was a strength that held the Vikings together. They were not a people who accepted failure as the end. If the hunt failed, they would turn to other means. They would forage. They would fish. They would rely on the food stores that had been preserved through the warmer months. But most importantly, they would share. The Viking community was built on the concept of kinship and solidarity. When one hunter failed, it was not just his failure, it was the failure of everyone, but also the responsibility of everyone. The bonds of community, forged through shared labor and mutual reliance, were what ensured that no one would go hungry, at least not for long. The Vikings did not simply survive. They adapted, they endured, and they made the most of whatever they had. A failed hunt was a setback, but it was never the end. It was a challenge, one that tested their ingenuity and their resolve. The failure of a hunt reminded them that survival was never guaranteed, that nature was both a provider and a punisher. But it also reminded them that together, they could face anything. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the cold stretched on, the Vikings would wait, hoping that the next hunt would bring success, or, failing that the strength of the community would carry them through until the spring thaw. In the end, it was not the hunt itself that defined the Viking spirit, but the resilience shown in the face of failure. Even when nature denied them success, they did not give up. They simply adjusted, adapted, and moved forward, as a people, as a community, and as survivors. When the chill of winter settles in across the Viking lands, survival becomes a delicate balancing act between foresight and resourcefulness. The Vikings, as masters of their environment, were keenly aware that to endure the unforgiving cold, they had to ensure that their food stores would stretch far enough to make it through the long, dark months ahead. Their methods of preservation were not just about keeping food from spoiling, they were a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity and their deep understanding of nature's cycles. For them, food preservation was an art, a necessity, and a way of life that made the difference between life and death when the seasons turned against them. Unlike modern conveniences that allow us to stockpile food indefinitely, the Vikings had to rely on methods that could preserve food without refrigeration or modern chemicals. In the harsh winters, when fresh game became scarce and the crops were buried under layers of snow, the Vikings turned to techniques that had been passed down through generations. Preservation was essential not only to survive, but to thrive when nature's bounty would otherwise be out of reach. One of the most important methods of preserving food was drying. Drying was a simple yet effective technique that removed moisture from food, preventing the growth of bacteria and fungi that caused spoilage. The Vikings were particularly adept at drying fish, meat, and even fruits. Fish, abundant in the cold northern seas, were a primary food source for the Vikings, and drying was their preferred method of preservation. Cod, herring, and salmon were often caught in large quantities and then dried on racks under the sun or smoked over fires. The dried fish could then be stored for months, providing a critical protein source when fresh fish was unavailable due to the freezing waters. Meat, too, was dried to last through the winter. Whether from domestic animals like cattle and pigs, or from wild game like deer and boar, the Vikings would hang cuts of meat to dry in the cold air. This process not only preserved the meat but intensified its flavor, making it a valuable addition to the Viking larder. Once dried, the meat could be rehydrated in stews, boiled in broths, or simply eaten as jerky. The preservation of meat was a skill that the Vikings had perfected, and it was one of the primary ways they survived the winter months when fresh food was scarce. In addition to drying, smoking was another vital preservation method. Smoking was particularly useful for preserving larger cuts of meat, such as whole pigs or deer carcasses. The Vikings would build a smokehouse or use the hearth of their longhouse to hang meat and fish, allowing the smoke to cure it over time. The slow, smoky process would infuse the food with a deep, rich flavor while keeping it safe from rot. Smoke also helped prevent insects from infesting the stored food, adding an extra layer of protection. Smoked fish, like dried fish, could last for months, and it became a vital component of the Viking diet during the coldest months of the year. Salt was also a crucial element in the Vikings' food preservation techniques. Salt was used not only to season food, but also to cure meat and fish. The Vikings would pack cuts of meat in salt, allowing it to draw out moisture and prevent spoilage. Salted fish was a staple of the Viking diet, as it could be stored for long periods and was easy to prepare when needed. The Vikings knew that salt was a precious commodity, one that could make the difference between starvation and survival. It was often traded with other cultures, and those who had access to large supplies of salt had a significant advantage in terms of food preservation. Salted fish and meat were often rehydrated in water or broth to make them edible again, though they were not as fresh as their unpreserved counterparts. Fermentation was another technique that the Vikings used, though it was less common than drying, smoking, or salting. Fermented foods, such as dairy products and vegetables, could be stored for long periods and were an essential source of nutrition when fresh foods were unavailable. Milk, a staple of the Viking diet, was often turned into cheese or butter, which could be preserved for months. In some cases, milk was fermented into yogurt, which provided beneficial bacteria that helped with digestion and boosted the immune system. These fermented dairy products were not only a source of nutrition but also a way to keep valuable food from spoiling before it could be eaten. Vegetables, which were a key part of the Viking diet, were typically stored in cool, dark places, such as cellars, to keep them fresh during the winter. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and onions were particularly useful because they could be harvested in late autumn and stored through the winter months. These hardy vegetables could survive the cold and provide important vitamins and nutrients when fresh greens were unavailable. In some cases, vegetables were also pickled or fermented to extend their shelf life. Fermented cabbage, for example, could be stored in jars or barrels and used throughout the winter months as a side dish or as an addition to stews. Berries and fruits, though not as commonly preserved as meat or fish, were also an important part of the Viking diet. The Vikings were skilled at foraging for wild berries in the summer months, and they would preserve these fruits by drying them, fermenting them into beverages, or making jams and preserves. Lingonberries, bilberries, and cloudberries were all common fruits that the Vikings would gather and preserve for the winter. These fruits could be added to porridge or eaten as a sweet treat during the cold months. In addition, they were used in the production of fermented beverages, such as mead, which the Vikings would drink during feasts and gatherings. Grains, such as barley, oats, and rye, were also important to the Viking diet, and they were carefully stored to ensure they would last through the winter. The Vikings would store their grain in large sacks or bins, keeping it in cool, dry places to prevent spoilage. In times of scarcity, grains could be made into porridges or flatbreads, which were filling and nutritious. These grains also formed the basis for the production of ale and beer, which was an essential part of Viking culture. Grains were versatile, and the Vikings would use them in a variety of ways, from making bread to brewing their own alcohol. All of these preservation techniques, drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and storing, were not just methods for keeping food, they were methods for ensuring the Viking way of life could endure through even the harshest winters. Each technique was rooted in a deep understanding of nature and the cycles of the seasons. The Vikings knew that the cold months could be punishing, but they also knew that they had the knowledge and the tools to survive. Their ability to preserve food was a key factor in their resilience, allowing them to endure through the darkest, coldest months when the world outside seemed impossible to conquer. When we look back at the Vikings' methods for surviving winter, we see not only their ingenuity and resourcefulness but also their connection to the land. They were people who understood that nature provided abundantly at times, but also took away without warning. They learned to work with the land, to take only what they needed, and to store what they could for the leaner months. Through preservation, the Vikings ensured that they could weather the cold, dark winters and emerge once again into the light when spring finally arrived. As the Vikings settled in the rugged terrains of Scandinavia, they faced an environment that was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. The frozen waters, dense forests, and snow-covered fields offered challenges but also vast resources. Beyond the hunt and the stores of preserved food, foraging and fishing played crucial roles in Viking survival. When hunting faltered or food stores dwindled, These secondary but vital methods of gathering sustenance could mean the difference between life and death. The art of foraging was embedded in the Viking way of life, a necessary skill that complemented their farming, hunting, and fishing practices. The Vikings were keen observers of the land, knowing the plants, fungi, berries, and herbs that could nourish them or provide medicinal benefits. As winter set in and the land became more barren, foraging became a subtle but essential part of their daily routine. In a world where fresh food was not guaranteed, the Vikings turned to nature to supply the missing pieces of their diet. In the thick of winter, when hunting proved difficult and stored food began to dwindle, foraging for hardy, winter-resistant plants was essential. While most vegetation had died off or been covered by snow, certain root vegetables, mosses, and even winter herbs could still be found beneath the frost. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions were all winter staples that could be harvested late in the fall and stored in cool, dry conditions for later use. However, during the harshest months, when the snow would cover the ground, these roots could be dug up again, providing valuable nutrients to supplement the meager food stores. They could be boiled into soups or stews, their robust, earthy flavors adding hardiness to otherwise simple meals. The Vikings also foraged for wild herbs and plants, many of which could be used to flavor food, as well as to treat illnesses or injuries. They collected garlic, thyme, juniper berries, and elderberries, each offering its own set of healing properties. These herbs not only enriched the flavor of Viking dishes but were key in combating the ailments that could arise in the bitter cold. In a society where medical knowledge was based on natural remedies, the Vikings' understanding of plants and herbs was vital for their well-being. Elderberry, for instance, was well known for its ability to ward off infections and strengthen the immune system, which was critical when cold temperatures weakened the body and made it more susceptible to illness. In addition to these medicinal herbs, mushrooms were another key forageable food. While the cold ground limited the types of mushrooms that could be harvested during winter, the Vikings knew how to identify the ones that were safe to eat and which ones were toxic. Some fungi could be dried and stored for later use, providing nutrients when other food sources were low. The Vikings also turned to wild berries, such as lingonberries, cloudberries, and bilberries, which grew in abundance during the short summer months. These berries were often preserved by drying, allowing them to be used throughout the year, particularly in winter when fresh fruits were unavailable. Their natural sugars provided a much-needed burst of energy during the long, hard months. However, foraging was not just about gathering food, it was about survival in the truest sense. The Vikings understood the land's rhythms, the delicate balance between taking and giving. They foraged with purpose, extracting only what they needed to get by and leaving the land to regenerate. Their respect for nature's cycles and their deep knowledge of the ecosystem allowed them to live in harmony with the land, ensuring they didn't deplete their resources. While foraging was an invaluable practice, fishing was another skill that the Vikings had perfected to ensure their survival. The Vikings lived in coastal regions surrounded by the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and countless fjords, which teemed with fish. Fishing was a vital part of the Viking diet, especially in the winter months when land-based food sources became more scarce. With their long history of seafaring and navigation, the Vikings had developed sophisticated techniques for catching fish, ranging from simple handlines to more complex nets and traps. Fish, such as cod, herring, and salmon, were the primary species caught by the Vikings, and they formed the backbone of the Viking diet. Fishing in the cold, often stormy waters, required skill, patience, and knowledge of the tides and currents. In some coastal regions, fishing was so central to life that entire communities were built around it. The Vikings would often fish from boats or from the shore, casting nets into the deep, icy waters or using spears and harpoons to catch larger fish. Fishing was not just a means of obtaining food, it was a skill passed down through generations, embedded in the Viking way of life. The abundance of fish provided an essential protein source that helped sustain Viking communities through the cold winter months when hunting was less reliable. Cod was especially important due to its availability in large quantities and its suitability for drying and salting. Fish were often caught, cleaned, and then dried on racks or salted to preserve them for later use. Salted fish, a staple in the Viking diet, could be stored for months and was a crucial part of the Vikings' food supply. These preserved fish could be rehydrated in stews or boiled with other preserved vegetables when fresh food was in short supply. Herring, another staple, was particularly valuable because of its abundance and the ease with which it could be preserved. The Vikings would often catch herring in great quantities during certain times of the year, using weirs, nets, and traps. Once caught, the herring would be salted or smoked, then stored in barrels for the winter. These preserved fish would become an essential part of the diet during the lean months, when other food sources were unavailable. In addition to providing food, herring was also an important trade commodity. The Vikings traded salted herring with other cultures, exchanging it for goods such as timber, wool, and even salt. Fishing wasn't just a practical necessity, it was also deeply ingrained in Viking culture. The act of fishing itself was often viewed as a communal activity, a way for family and village members to come together, working side by side to ensure the survival of the group. Fishing expeditions, often undertaken in boats known as longships, were opportunities for bonding, storytelling, and strengthening the connections between individuals. Just as with foraging, fishing served to reinforce the Viking belief in the importance of community and cooperation, emphasizing the value of each person's contribution to the group's overall well-being. As winter progressed, fishing would become an increasingly important means of sustaining the Viking community. With the freezing of rivers and fjords, the Vikings had to rely on their stored catch, supplemented by whatever they could forage or hunt. The importance of the fish preserved during the more abundant months could not be overstated. Without the ability to preserve fish through drying or salting, the Vikings would have faced significant hardships during the cold months. The preserved fish, stored in cool, dry places, would remain a reliable food source throughout the winter, providing protein and fat when other foods were exhausted. While fishing was a critical source of food, it was not without its dangers. The cold, often violent seas could be treacherous, and the Vikings were well aware of the risks involved in venturing out on the water during the winter months. Storms, freezing temperatures, and the threat of shipwrecks were constant concerns for those who made their living from the sea. But for the Vikings, fishing was not just a means of survival, it was an essential part of their identity. The sea had provided for them for generations, and the bond between the Vikings and the water was unbreakable. In summary, foraging and fishing were crucial to Viking survival, especially during the harsh winter months when other food sources became scarce. The Vikings' intimate knowledge of the land and sea, their ability to forage for medicinal herbs and winter vegetables, and their expertise in fishing and preserving fish allowed them to endure the challenges of winter. These practices were not just about feeding the body, they were about maintaining a connection to the natural world, ensuring that the community could thrive even in the most unforgiving of seasons. Through these methods, the Vikings were able to turn the harsh northern winter into another season of resilience, adaptation, and survival. For the Vikings, survival during the long winter months was a battle not only of physical endurance but also of mental and emotional strength. The relentless cold, the perpetual darkness, and the isolation of winter took their toll on the Viking people, testing their resilience in ways that went beyond mere physical survival. While their skills in hunting, foraging, and preservation allowed them to endure the winter's hardships, it was their ability to cope with the psychological pressures of the season that often determined whether they would make it through to the spring. Imagine living in a world where the sun barely rises above the horizon for months at a time, where the days are short, the nights long and bitterly cold, and the landscape is a constant reminder of nature's harshness. For the Vikings, winter was not just a season of scarcity, but a season of confinement, both physically and mentally. The cold and darkness created an environment that was physically challenging, but it also had a profound psychological effect on the Viking people. In a society that prided itself on strength, courage, and survival, the mental and emotional toll of winter could be just as devastating as the physical hardships. As the days grew shorter and the temperatures plummeted, the Vikings were forced to spend more time indoors. The longhouse, typically a hub of activity and social interaction during the warmer months, became a place of confinement during winter. Families huddled together for warmth, often living in close quarters with little personal space. The close living arrangements, while necessary for survival, also heightened tensions. In such a small, confined space, the strain of isolation and monotony could wear on a person's mental well-being. The constant cold and lack of sunlight affected not just the body, but also the mind. Seasonal affective disorder, though not recognized by the Vikings as a modern concept, likely played a significant role in the psychological struggles they faced. The lack of sunlight and the endless nights could lead to feelings of depression, lethargy, and hopelessness. The emotional toll of winter was particularly difficult for those who were most vulnerable: the elderly, the sick, and the very young. The Vikings knew that winter was a time of great risk, where the weak or the ill were more likely to succumb to disease, hunger, or cold. The very real fear of loss would have weighed heavily on families. Elders, though respected for their wisdom, were often the first to suffer when food supplies dwindled, or when the cold became unbearable. The younger generations, too, would have felt the stress of seeing their parents and grandparents struggle. For the Vikings, death in winter was not just a natural occurrence, but an ever-present specter that threatened to break the family unit. In the face of such challenges, the Vikings developed various coping mechanisms to maintain their mental and emotional stability. One of the most important tools for survival was their deep sense of community. The bonds between family members and neighbors were essential to maintaining emotional strength during the darkest months. Despite the physical challenges of winter, the Vikings relied on each other to get through. This communal spirit was reflected in the way they shared resources, helped each other with tasks, and provided emotional support. In many ways, winter was a test not only of physical endurance but of social cohesion. The Vikings understood that their survival depended on their ability to work together, to share in the hardships, and to support one another. Storytelling, too, played a vital role in helping the Vikings cope with the emotional strain of winter. The longhouse, where families gathered around the fire to stay warm, became a place where tales of heroism, gods, and ancestors were passed down from generation to generation. These stories not only served to entertain but also to inspire. They reminded the Vikings of their strength, their heritage, and their resilience in the face of adversity. Through storytelling, the Vikings connected to their past and reinforced the values that defined their culture: bravery, loyalty, and the will to endure. These stories would have been particularly important during the long, cold nights, when time seemed to stand still and the weight of isolation and monotony was at its heaviest. In addition to stories, the Vikings also engaged in rituals and ceremonies that helped them maintain their emotional and spiritual well-being. The winter solstice, marking the longest night of the year, was a significant time for the Vikings. It was a time of reflection, but also of hope, as it symbolized the return of the sun. They would gather for feasts, honoring the gods and celebrating the promise of warmer days to come. These rituals not only provided comfort during the bleakest time of year but also reaffirmed the Vikings' belief in the cycles of nature, the understanding that the harsh winter would eventually give way to the rebirth of spring. By celebrating the return of the light, the Vikings reinforced the belief that they were not at the mercy of the elements, but that they could persevere through any hardship. Yet, despite the communal spirit, winter isolation was still a deeply challenging experience. For those who lived in more remote areas, the distance from other settlements made it harder to rely on others. The Viking people knew that they had to be prepared to survive on their own, and the isolation of winter often meant that they were cut off from their neighbors for long stretches of time. This sense of isolation could exacerbate feelings of loneliness and despair, particularly for those who were without family or community. The mental toll of winter in these cases would have been even more pronounced, as the physical discomfort of the cold was compounded by the emotional burden of isolation. The winter months also brought with them a sense of powerlessness. The Vikings, though formidable warriors and skilled farmers, could not control the weather, nor could they escape the reality of winter's cruelty. They were at the mercy of nature's rhythms, and the unpredictability of the season made it even more difficult to plan and prepare. The cold and darkness were not just external forces but psychological ones, constantly looming over the Vikings, reminding them that their survival was not guaranteed. In these moments of powerlessness, the Vikings would have had to rely on their inner strength, the belief that they could endure, no matter how difficult the conditions. Mental resilience, therefore, became just as important as physical strength. The Vikings did not simply endure the winter, they adapted to it. They used the long nights to plan, to bond, and to reflect. They saw winter not as a time of defeat but as a challenge to be met with patience, perseverance, and unity. Their ability to endure the emotional toll of winter, to push through the darkness and the cold, was a testament to their mental fortitude. They did not shy away from the hardships of the season, but rather, they embraced them as part of their journey. For the Vikings, surviving winter was about more than simply surviving the cold. It was about maintaining their identity, their community, and their belief in themselves. The mental and emotional resilience they cultivated during the darkest months of the year was what allowed them to emerge from winter stronger, ready to face the challenges of the coming spring. The emotional toll of winter was great, but so was their capacity to endure. And it was this spirit of perseverance that defined the Viking people, making them not just survivors of winter, but conquerors of the cold. For the Vikings, winter was not just a time of physical struggle, it was also a deeply spiritual and emotional experience. The long, cold months of darkness and isolation were shaped by a complex web of beliefs and rituals that helped the Vikings make sense of their world and find meaning in the harshest of times. Survival in the Viking world was not simply about enduring the elements or battling against the odds. It was about understanding the forces of nature, the gods, and the cycles of life and death. Their beliefs provided a framework for coping with the darkness, the cold, and the uncertainty of the winter season. The Vikings' relationship with winter was intertwined with their belief in the power of the gods and the natural world. For them, the changing seasons were not random events, but manifestations of divine will. Winter, with its long nights and bitter cold, was seen as a time of hardship, yes, but also a time of potential transformation. They believed that every cycle of nature had a deeper meaning, and winter was no exception. The darkness of winter, though oppressive, was not to be feared. It was seen as part of a larger cosmic balance, a necessary counterpart to the light of summer. And through rituals and spiritual practices, the Vikings tried to make peace with the winter's challenges, invoking the protection of their gods to help them endure. The gods, in Viking belief, were intimately connected to the natural world, and each god was associated with different aspects of life and nature. The winter solstice, which marked the shortest day and the longest night of the year, was a particularly significant time for the Vikings. It symbolized the turning point in the year, when the darkness began to recede and the days slowly started to lengthen. The Vikings believed that the solstice marked the return of the sun, and they celebrated it as a time of rebirth, renewal, and hope. The long, dark nights of winter were thought to be a battle between the forces of light and darkness, a cosmic struggle that could be overcome through ritual and worship. In Viking culture, the sun was personified as the goddess Sol, who rode across the sky in a chariot drawn by 2 horses. Her journey across the heavens was essential to maintaining the balance of the world. During the winter months, Sol's chariot was thought to slow down, and the nights grew longer. But as the solstice passed, the Vikings believed that Sol's journey would pick up speed again, and the sun would begin to rise higher in the sky, bringing warmth and light to the world. This cyclical understanding of the seasons gave the Vikings a sense of hope and purpose, even in the darkest months. The winter solstice, then, was more than just an astronomical event. It was a time to celebrate the power of the sun, to honor Sol, and to reaffirm the belief that light would eventually return to the world. To mark this important time, the Vikings held elaborate feasts and rituals in honor of the gods. These were not just occasions for merriment, but sacred ceremonies that bound the community together. At the heart of these winter solstice celebrations was the Yule festival, a time to honor both the gods and the ancestors. The Yule feast was held in the Longhouse, where families gathered around the fire to share food, drink, and stories. The feast was a way of affirming the bonds of kinship and community, and it was often accompanied by prayers, sacrifices, and offerings to the gods. These rituals were designed to ensure the protection and prosperity of the community during the coming year. One of the most important figures in Viking winter rituals was Odin, the Allfather. Odin was the god of war, wisdom, and death, but he was also deeply associated with the winter months. It was said that Odin rode his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, across the skies during the long nights, seeking knowledge and wisdom. His presence during the winter was thought to provide guidance and protection to those who were struggling to survive. During the winter solstice, many Vikings would make offerings to Odin, asking for his blessing and protection. These offerings might include sacrifices of food, drink, or even animals, which were given in the hope of securing Odin's favor for the coming year. The Yule log was another important symbol of winter rituals. The Yule log was a large, specially selected log that was brought into the longhouse and placed on the hearth to burn throughout the winter solstice. The burning of the Yule log was a symbolic act that represented the return of the sun. As the log burned, it was believed to provide warmth and light, both literally and metaphorically. The ashes from the Yule log were often kept as a form of protection, believed to hold the power of the sun's return. In some Viking communities, the ashes were scattered around the home to ensure good fortune and to ward off evil spirits during the dark months of winter. In addition to these rituals honoring the gods, the Vikings also believed in the importance of ancestor worship. Ancestors were seen as spiritual protectors, and the Vikings regularly invoked their guidance and protection. During the winter months, particularly around the time of the solstice, the Vikings would perform rituals to honor their ancestors, making offerings at ancestral graves or holding feasts in their memory. These rituals were not just about reverence for the past, they were also about ensuring the continued support of the spirits of the ancestors, who were believed to be integral to the survival of the living. In the darkness of winter, the memory of the ancestors provided a sense of continuity and stability. By honoring the past, the Vikings believed they could secure blessings for the future. These rituals and beliefs were not merely symbolic. They were believed to have a direct impact on the lives of the Vikings. The rituals offered a way to align themselves with the natural rhythms of the world, to find comfort in the knowledge that the forces of nature and the gods were always at work. The repetition of these rituals year after year created a sense of structure and meaning in an otherwise chaotic and uncertain world. The Vikings' connection to their gods, their ancestors, and the cycles of nature was essential to maintaining their sense of purpose and identity, especially during the most difficult months of the year. Even as the Vikings faced the challenges of winter, their faith in these rituals helped them find a sense of peace and acceptance. Winter was, in many ways, a time of inner reflection. It was a time to look inward, to honor the gods, and to prepare for the challenges of the coming year. The rituals offered the Vikings a way to cope with the emotional and physical toll of winter. They were not just a means of surviving the cold, they were a means of finding meaning in it. Through these winter rituals, the Vikings found strength in the cycles of nature and in the belief that they were part of a larger, cosmic struggle. They knew that winter would eventually give way to spring, just as the darkness would eventually be overcome by the light. Their faith in the gods, the rituals, and the power of the natural world provided them with the emotional fortitude to endure the winter and the hope to carry them through the darkest days. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, these rituals and beliefs became a source of comfort, resilience, and meaning. And as the first rays of the sun began to pierce the darkness, the Vikings knew that they had survived the winter once again, their connection to the divine and to the natural world stronger than ever. While the Vikings are often celebrated for their prowess in warfare and exploration, their survival through the harsh winters was also heavily dependent on the vast network of trade and barter that spanned across their world. This trade network not only brought essential resources but also helped maintain relationships with neighboring cultures, fostering a sense of community and mutual dependence that proved invaluable during the coldest months. The winter was a time of scarcity, and it was through trade, exchange, and cooperation that the Vikings were able to survive, even thrive, when food stores dwindled and the land seemed unforgiving. Trade was a vital part of Viking life, and the need to obtain goods and resources that could not be found locally or in sufficient quantities was particularly pressing during the winter. Vikings were known for their seafaring skills, and this gave them access to distant lands far beyond the shores of Scandinavia. These voyages were not just about plunder or conquest, they were also about establishing trade routes and gathering commodities that would be crucial for survival during the winter months. The Vikings traded with a vast array of cultures, from the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world to the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic peoples. These interactions brought a rich variety of goods into Viking hands, including precious metals, spices, textiles, and, crucially, foodstuffs. Salt was one of the most important trade goods for the Vikings, particularly during the winter months. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish, both of which were crucial components of the Viking diet. Without salt, the Vikings would not have been able to store their fish or meat for long periods, and they would have faced even greater food scarcity during the cold months. Salt, though relatively abundant in some Viking territories, was not always easy to come by, especially in the colder, more northern regions. As a result, salt became a valuable commodity that was often traded with other cultures. In exchange for salt, the Vikings would offer goods such as furs, timber, iron, and weapons, which were highly prized by their trading partners. The acquisition of salt allowed the Vikings to preserve food and ensure that their winter stores would last through the long, harsh months. Another key item in Viking trade was fur. The vast forests of Scandinavia were home to a wide range of fur-bearing animals, such as otters, wolves, and bears. These furs were highly prized not only for their warmth but also as a symbol of wealth and status. The Vikings traded fur with many of their neighbors, including the Slavic peoples, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Franks. Fur was particularly valuable during the winter months, when it could be used to make clothing and blankets that would protect against the bitter cold. Fur was also used in trade with distant lands, where it could fetch a high price. The Vikings, ever resourceful, turned the harsh conditions of winter into an opportunity for economic exchange, using the animals of the land to provide warmth and wealth. Timber was another crucial trade good. Scandinavia's dense forests provided the Vikings with an abundance of wood, which they used to build their ships, homes, and longhouses. However, timber was also in high demand in other parts of Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean, where it was needed for shipbuilding and construction. The Vikings traded timber, along with iron and other goods, in exchange for resources they could not produce themselves, such as grain and other foodstuffs. Timber was essential not only for building the ships that the Vikings used for their raids and explorations but also for constructing the homes and shelters that would protect them from the winter elements. During the winter, the timber trade was a lifeline that allowed the Vikings to maintain their infrastructure and ensure that they had the necessary materials to survive the cold months. In addition to these tangible goods, the Vikings also traded in luxury items, such as silver and gold, which were often obtained through raids but also served as valuable commodities in trade. Precious metals were not only used as currency but were also fashioned into jewelry and decorative items, which were highly sought after by Viking elites and neighboring cultures. These items, though not essential for survival, played an important role in maintaining social status and fostering relationships with other cultures. The exchange of wealth, whether in the form of metals, fur, or timber, was an essential part of Viking society and helped ensure that their communities were connected to a broader network of trade and influence. The Vikings' trading activities were not limited to physical goods. They also engaged in the exchange of knowledge, particularly in the realms of shipbuilding, navigation, and military strategy. The Vikings were excellent sailors, and their ability to navigate treacherous waters was unmatched. This skill allowed them to establish trade routes across the seas, connecting them with distant lands. As they traveled, the Vikings shared their expertise in shipbuilding and navigation with other cultures, and they learned in turn. The exchange of knowledge, though less tangible than goods, was equally important for Viking survival. The ability to build better ships, navigate with greater precision, and understand the cultures they encountered helped the Vikings expand their trade networks and ensure that they could access the resources they needed, particularly in times of hardship. Barter played an equally important role in the Viking trade system. While the Vikings traded with neighboring cultures using precious metals or commodities, they also relied heavily on bartering within their own communities and with other Viking clans. The process of bartering allowed them to exchange goods they had in abundance for those they lacked. For example, a Viking who had a surplus of fish might trade it for grains or vegetables from a neighboring community. Similarly, a blacksmith might trade weapons or tools for furs or foodstuffs. Bartering allowed for the direct exchange of goods without the need for currency, making it a practical and flexible system in a world where resources were often scarce. In times of extreme hardship, barter became even more crucial. The Vikings did not always have access to the goods they needed to survive the winter. When food supplies ran low or hunting proved unsuccessful, bartering allowed them to acquire necessary items without having to rely on cash or external markets. For the Vikings, trade and barter were not just about acquiring wealth, they were about survival. The exchange of goods and resources created a network of mutual dependence that allowed Viking communities to endure through the harshest of winters. Trade also helped maintain a sense of interconnectedness and solidarity within Viking society. The winter months, with their isolation and confinement, could be particularly challenging for the Vikings, who were accustomed to the freedom of the open sea and the bustling energy of their longhouses. But through trade, the Vikings maintained connections with other groups, even if only through the exchange of goods. These connections helped stave off the isolation that could otherwise lead to despair during the long winter nights. Ultimately, trade was not just a practical necessity, it was a cornerstone of Viking identity. The ability to trade, to barter, and to establish economic relationships with other cultures was a symbol of the Vikings' resourcefulness, adaptability, and resilience. Through trade, the Vikings were able to survive the winter, not just physically, but emotionally and socially as well. Trade brought the resources that were necessary for survival, but it also connected the Vikings to a wider world, giving them a sense of purpose and a reminder that they were part of a larger, interconnected network. It was this sense of connection and mutual dependence that helped the Vikings thrive through the winter and face the challenges of the cold season with confidence and resolve. Viking society, like many ancient cultures, was built around a strong sense of social structure and community. In the harsh northern winters, this structure became even more essential, as each individual's role contributed to the survival of the larger group. From the high-born chieftains and warriors to the farmers and craftsmen, every member of Viking society had a part to play in ensuring the community could weather the cold months. It was not only the skills of the individual but the ability to cooperate and work together that allowed Viking communities to survive the brutal winter season. In a world where resources were limited and conditions were unforgiving, the Viking social structure was a model of interdependence and shared responsibility. At the top of the Viking social hierarchy were the chieftains or jarls, who wielded power over specific territories. These leaders were not only political figures but also served as symbols of strength, authority, and protection for their people. During the winter months, the jarl's role became particularly important. While the chieftain's primary duty was to lead in battle and to expand the territory through raids, they were also responsible for ensuring that their people had the resources they needed to survive the cold months. This might involve overseeing the distribution of food supplies, managing the community's winter stores, or ensuring that everyone was contributing to the communal effort. The chieftain was the central figure who maintained order, coordinated trade and alliances, and provided for the well-being of their people, even during the difficult winter months. Under the jarl were the warriors, known as carls, who formed the backbone of Viking military and social structure. These individuals were usually free men, often farmers or traders by day, but also trained fighters. During the long winter months, when raids and battles were not possible, carls focused on other vital tasks. Many worked the land, ensuring that their crops and animals were well-fed and ready for the next season. Others spent time honing their skills as craftsmen, repairing tools, weapons, and boats. Carls also acted as the first line of defense for the community during times of attack or invasion. In the winter, when Viking settlements were vulnerable to raids or natural disasters, these warriors played a critical role in protecting their homes and ensuring the safety of their families. However, it was not only the jarl and the carls who contributed to the community's survival during winter. The structure of Viking society also placed a significant emphasis on the roles of women, children, and the elderly. In many respects, it was the cooperative efforts of every member of the household that allowed the Vikings to thrive during the colder months. Women played an integral role in the day-to-day management of the home, particularly in the winter when outdoor work was limited. They were responsible for maintaining the household, preparing food, and preserving it for the winter months. Women also tended to livestock, spun wool, and wove clothing and blankets that would protect the family from the cold. In addition to their domestic duties, women played a role in Viking religious practices, performing rituals and sacrifices to ensure the favor of the gods during the harsh season. It was the women's labor that kept the household running smoothly and ensured that there was enough food to last through the winter. The elderly, while no longer physically able to participate in the hard labor required for survival, were still considered valuable members of Viking society. Older individuals were often revered for their wisdom and experience, and their counsel was sought in matters of decision-making. During the winter months, the elderly played an important role as storytellers, passing down history, myths, and traditions to the younger generations. This oral tradition kept the community's culture alive and provided a sense of continuity. In addition, the elderly were often responsible for imparting essential survival knowledge to the younger members of society. They taught the children how to identify edible plants, how to fish, or how to protect themselves from the harsh elements. Their accumulated knowledge about the land, the sea, and the changing seasons was invaluable for the survival of the entire community. Children, though not yet contributing fully to the practical needs of the household, were vital to Viking society as well. The winter months were a time of learning and preparation for the younger generation. Children helped with tasks such as fetching water, gathering firewood, and assisting with food preparation. They were also taught essential survival skills, such as how to hunt, fish, and work with animals. These skills were passed down from parent to child, ensuring that the next generation would be able to survive when it became their turn to take on more responsibility. The communal nature of Viking society meant that every member, regardless of age, had a role to play, and each was integral to the group's overall survival. The structure of the Viking household, or hus, was typically a communal space shared by an extended family. This familial unit was the core of Viking life, and it was especially important during the winter months when individuals had to rely on one another to stay warm, share food, and maintain morale. In a typical Viking home, the hearth was the central gathering point where families and neighbors would come together to eat, work, and socialize. The hearth not only provided warmth but also served as a place for storytelling, bonding, and the exchange of knowledge. During the long, cold nights, the hearth was where the community came to life, with each member contributing their share to ensure the household's continued survival. The concept of OL, or ale, was central to Viking social life, especially during the winter months. Ale was consumed not just as a drink but as a means of fostering social cohesion. The Vikings brewed their own beer from barley, and it was often shared during feasts, rituals, and celebrations. These gatherings were vital to maintaining morale during the bleak winter, as they provided an opportunity for the community to come together, share stories, and reinforce their bonds. Feasts were often held in honor of the gods or ancestors, and the sharing of ale was seen as a way to honor these figures and ensure that the community would receive their blessings for the coming year. While individual roles in the Viking community were critical for survival, it was the ability of the people to cooperate and work together that allowed them to endure the winter. In many ways, the Vikings' ability to survive the harsh northern winters can be attributed to their sense of unity and shared responsibility. From the leadership of the Jarl to the contributions of the warriors, farmers, women, children, and the elderly, every individual was an integral part of the larger whole. The Vikings understood that survival was not just about individual strength but about the collective strength of the community. The Viking social structure, with its emphasis on cooperation, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, was the key to the community's survival during the winter months. The harsh conditions forced individuals to rely on each other for warmth, sustenance, and emotional support. Whether it was the Jarl organizing the winter stores, the women preserving food, or the children learning the skills necessary for the future, every role played a part in ensuring that the community could face the challenges of winter with resilience. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the unity and cooperation of the Viking people allowed them to endure, emerge from winter, and continue to thrive in the changing seasons. For the Vikings, winter was not merely a season to endure, but a time for reflection, renewal, and preparation. In their worldview, time was cyclical. The arrival of winter was not something to fear but rather an inevitable part of the natural order, a period that allowed the community to rest, regroup, and prepare for the challenges of the coming spring and summer. The harsh northern winters, with their long nights and cold days, offered the perfect opportunity to reflect on past actions, to strengthen bonds with family and community, and to prepare for the inevitable return of the more challenging months of activity. Unlike the modern world, where we often rush forward in pursuit of progress, the Vikings understood time as a rhythm, a series of interconnected cycles governed by the natural world. Their calendar was structured around these rhythms, and the passage of time was marked by the changing seasons, the cycles of the moon, and the movement of the stars. The seasons themselves had distinct roles to play within the Viking cultural fabric, and winter held a special place in the hearts of the people. It was seen as a time of rest and recuperation, where the busy work of planting, harvesting, and raiding could give way to quiet contemplation and personal growth. Winter, therefore, was not a dead time. It was the moment when the community could take stock of their resources, review their strategies, and look inward. As the cold and darkness settled over the land, the Vikings found solace in the stillness, in the quiet that filled the long nights. It was during this time that the people could reflect on their actions over the past year, both individually and as a community. Whether it was the success of a raid or the failure of a hunt, winter offered an opportunity for the Vikings to look back and assess what had worked, what had not, and what needed to change. This practice of self-reflection was a deeply ingrained part of Viking culture, and it was vital for maintaining balance in their lives. During these long nights of reflection, the Vikings also turned to their gods. The gods played an essential role in shaping how the Vikings viewed time, especially in relation to the cycles of the seasons. Many of the Viking gods were associated with various aspects of the natural world, from the winds and the seas to the harvests and the changing of the seasons. These gods were believed to have the power to influence the course of events, and the Vikings understood that the natural world cycles were driven by divine forces. During the winter, the Vikings would reflect on their relationship with the gods, offering sacrifices and prayers to ensure their favor in the coming year. They might seek the blessing of Odin for wisdom or ask Thor for protection in battle. The winter months allowed the Vikings to reconnect with their spiritual beliefs and reaffirm their place within the greater cosmic order. But winter was not just a time for spiritual reflection, it was also a time for personal preparation. In the Viking world, survival was not guaranteed. Every individual, from the lowliest farmer to the highest chieftain, was expected to contribute to the well-being of the community. And during winter, this responsibility was amplified. For those who had access to food, it was a time to ensure that supplies were adequate for the months ahead. Stored meat, salted fish, and preserved vegetables needed to be carefully monitored, as the risk of spoilage was high in the cold, humid winter air. A Viking who failed to prepare adequately for the winter would find themselves in a dangerous position, vulnerable to hunger and cold. It was, therefore, essential to spend the long winter months repairing tools, reinforcing the shelter, and ensuring that every aspect of survival was accounted for. Beyond the practicalities of food and shelter, the winter months were also seen as a time to strengthen relationships. The long, dark evenings provided a rare opportunity for extended families to come together, to tell stories, and to bond in ways that were not always possible during the busier seasons. The hearth of the longhouse became a focal point, where people gathered around the fire to share food, warmth, and stories. Storytelling was a vital part of Viking culture, and the long winter nights were perfect for passing down the sagas and tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These stories were more than just entertainment, they were the bedrock of Viking identity. Through storytelling, the younger generations learned the values and traditions of their ancestors, and the older generations passed on their wisdom, ensuring that the community's history would not be lost. These tales also helped the Vikings to understand their place within the world, framing their lives within a larger narrative of struggle, survival, and triumph. Moreover, winter was a time to prepare physically and mentally for the challenges ahead. For the Vikings, the spring and summer months were busy times of farming, raiding, and travel. The preparation for these months took considerable effort, and winter was the perfect time to ensure that everything was in place. Farmers used the winter months to sharpen their tools, mend their nets, and ready their livestock for the coming season. For those who would embark on raids or long voyages, winter was a time to train, to hone their combat skills, and to strengthen their bodies. Even though the snow might blanket the landscape and make travel impossible, The Vikings used winter as an opportunity to build their physical strength and endurance, ensuring that when the thaw came, they would be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The cyclical nature of Viking time also meant that winter was a time to honor the dead. The Vikings, who placed great importance on ancestral worship, would often hold ceremonies and feasts to honor their ancestors during the winter months. These rituals, which included offerings of food, drink, and sometimes sacrifices, were a way of ensuring that the spirits of the ancestors would watch over the family and provide protection for the coming year. The dead were believed to remain close to the living, and the rituals performed during the winter months served as a reminder of the ongoing relationship between the two worlds. These practices strengthened the bonds between generations and reminded the Vikings that they were part of a much larger cycle of life and death. In addition to these personal preparations, winter was also a time when the larger community came together to engage in collective projects. These projects might include building new longhouses, repairing boats, or creating weapons for the coming year. The long nights of winter gave the Vikings the time they needed to focus on these larger tasks without the distractions of daily life. Work was often done in groups, with skilled craftsmen teaching younger apprentices the trade. It was in these moments of cooperation that the Vikings found strength, ensuring that their community would be ready for the challenges of the next season. As winter drew to a close, the Vikings were not only prepared for the practical demands of spring and summer but were also spiritually and emotionally fortified. The quiet time of reflection and preparation had provided them with a sense of purpose and connection, both to their ancestors and to the natural world. By embracing the cyclical nature of time, the Vikings had learned to live in harmony with the seasons, finding meaning in the changes and challenges that each brought. The long winter months, once a source of dread, had become an essential part of the Viking way of life. Through reflection, preparation, and community, the Vikings were able to navigate the coldest and darkest months with resilience, emerging from winter not just as survivors, but as individuals and communities ready to face the new challenges of the changing year. The Viking legacy is often defined by their warrior spirit, their seafaring conquests, and their exploration of far-off lands. However, the ability of the Viking people to survive and thrive during the brutal winters of Scandinavia played a key role in shaping their identity and enduring influence. The harsh winter conditions, which tested the Vikings' physical, emotional, and mental resilience, became a defining feature of their culture. It is through the Vikings' ingenuity in facing the long, dark months of winter that we can better understand the survival strategies, community dynamics, and cultural values that enabled them to leave a lasting mark on history. The Vikings' relationship with winter is more than a tale of enduring harsh conditions. It is a testament to their resilience and adaptability. They didn't just survive the cold months, they found ways to make winter work for them. In many ways, winter became a season of transformation. The Vikings learned to embrace the cold, to use the long nights as a time of reflection, preparation, and renewal. Their ability to turn this challenging season into a time of personal and communal growth is one of the key reasons why their civilization flourished despite the odds. It is this combination of physical toughness and mental fortitude that laid the foundation for the Viking identity. The tough, battle-hardened Viking warriors we often think of today were shaped in part by the harsh winters they endured. While the Vikings' raids and conquests were critical to their identity as a warrior culture, their survival in the brutal northern environment helped forge the qualities of endurance, resourcefulness, and resilience that made them formidable in battle. The cold and isolation of winter forced the Vikings to be adaptable and inventive, skills they carried with them as they ventured into unfamiliar lands. The ability to endure the bitter cold, to forage for food in the snow, and to withstand the loneliness of the long winter nights mirrored the toughness that they would later demonstrate in warfare. Their strength was as much mental as it was physical, and their ability to persevere through adversity made them capable of achieving incredible feats of exploration, conquest, and cultural exchange. But the Viking legacy is not solely defined by the brutality of winter or their prowess in battle. The way they organized their societies to survive the cold months is just as significant. The Viking social structure, with its emphasis on cooperation, community, and the roles of every individual, helped create a cohesive society that could endure the toughest seasons. The Vikings' deep sense of social cohesion and mutual dependence meant that no one was left to face the challenges of winter alone. Every member of the community, from the warriors to the farmers to the women and children, had a role to play in ensuring the survival of the group. This sense of unity, of working together toward a common goal, became a central aspect of Viking culture and identity. The concept of the extended family, the hus, was integral to Viking survival during the winter. The longhouse, where extended families gathered, became a microcosm of Viking society. It was in these close quarters that the Vikings came together, shared food, told stories, and engaged in rituals that strengthened their bonds. The hearth at the center of the longhouse was not just a source of warmth. It was a symbol of unity and community. The family was not just a biological unit, but a social one, where each member's contributions were valued and each person's survival was dependent on the survival of the whole. This collective mentality was one of the most powerful forces in Viking culture, and it was this sense of community that allowed the Vikings to endure and ultimately thrive in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The Vikings' survival through the winter also speaks to their ingenuity and adaptability. As seafarers, they were skilled in navigating treacherous waters and exploring distant lands, but they also excelled at adapting to the harsh conditions of their homeland. The Viking longship, one of their greatest inventions, was not only a marvel of engineering but also a testament to their ability to design tools and structures suited for both combat and survival. Their ships were built to withstand rough seas and freezing temperatures, allowing the Vikings to travel far and wide, even during the harshest seasons. This adaptability, coupled with their deep knowledge of the land and its cycles, enabled them to survive and expand their influence throughout northern Europe, the British Isles, and beyond. Trade also played a crucial role in the Vikings' ability to survive the winter. Through their extensive trade networks, they were able to acquire goods that were essential for winter survival, such as salt for preserving food, furs for warmth, and timber for shelter. The Vikings' ability to establish and maintain these trade routes, often over vast distances, demonstrates their resourcefulness and ability to thrive even in the most challenging environments. They understood the importance of forging relationships with neighboring cultures, not just for raiding but for mutual support. The exchange of goods, ideas, and knowledge during the winter months helped sustain Viking communities and ensured their survival in a world where resources were scarce and unpredictable. But the Vikings' impact on history is not just defined by their survival strategies and military exploits. Their culture and legacy continue to influence modern society. The Vikings' spirit of exploration, innovation, and resilience remains a powerful symbol today. From their seafaring adventures to their mastery of trade and craftsmanship, the Vikings left a rich cultural imprint that transcended their time. In particular, the Viking way of life, a balance of personal strength, communal cooperation, and adaptability, continues to resonate in modern narratives of perseverance and survival. In many ways, the Viking ethos is reflected in how we face our own challenges, both on a personal level and as societies. The Vikings' legacy also lives on in their stories, which were passed down through generations. The sagas and myths that emerged from the Viking Age, stories of gods, heroes, and warriors, continue to shape our understanding of Viking culture and identity. These stories, many of which were shared around the hearth during the long winter nights, became a central part of Viking culture. They not only served to entertain but also to teach lessons about bravery, honor, and endurance. Even today, these tales of gods like Odin and Thor, of warriors like Ragnar Lothbrok and Bjorn Ironside, continue to captivate audiences. The Vikings' ability to turn their own challenges and hardships into stories of triumph has left a lasting legacy in literature and popular culture. The Viking influence is also felt in the modern world in more tangible ways. The Vikings' exploration and settlement of lands such as Iceland, Greenland, and parts of North America laid the groundwork for future exploration and colonization. Their shipbuilding techniques, which allowed them to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, revolutionized maritime travel and influenced naval technology for centuries. The Viking trading routes, which spanned from the Mediterranean to the Americas, helped create a network of cultural exchange that laid the foundation for the modern global economy. The Vikings' engagement with distant peoples helped spread ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, leaving a lasting impact on the regions they touched. Today, the Viking legacy remains a source of pride and fascination. The Viking Age continues to be a subject of study and exploration, with archaeological discoveries shedding new light on their lives and achievements. From their advanced shipbuilding techniques to their intricate metalwork, from their pagan rituals to their early experiments in democracy, the Vikings remain a vital part of our collective history. As modern societies continue to grapple with the challenges of survival and adaptation, the Viking story serves as a powerful reminder of the human capacity for resilience and ingenuity, even in the most difficult circumstances. In the end, it is the Vikings' ability to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, that defines their enduring legacy. Their mastery over the harshest of winters, their capacity for cooperation and innovation, and their connection to the cycles of nature are what truly set them apart. The winter, which once seemed like an insurmountable challenge, became a crucible in which their identity was forged. And it is this identity, one of strength, resilience, and adaptability, that continues to inspire and influence people around the world today.